So thank you for that very kind introduction. I'd like to thank all of the organizers for having me here and you all for taking the time on such a beautiful morning to spend it here. I'm going to talk to you about robotics. So I'm a roboticist. I work in the area of what we call robot learning, which is the intersection between machine learning, the ability to give machines the adaptive capabilities that we as humans think is important for us, and robotics as conventionally conceived in terms of physical and mechanical systems. So we are interested in asking the question, how do you take what is essentially just metal steel wires and put in something in algorithm such that it has the capacities that we would like to replicate? Now, every time I ask an audience like this, what is a robot, I get a completely different answer. So sometimes I ask kids and they say, oh, I know exactly what a robot is. It's what I see in the cartoons. Then I ask slightly grown-up kids and they say, we all know what a robot is. It's Terminator. And then I ask a different set of people and it's like, yeah, it's that thing that goes around doing vacuum cleaning. So none of them is a wrong answer. They're all perfectly good answers. And I bring up this simply to point out that it's very hard to pin down and say this is a robot and this is not a robot. And I would argue it's somewhat unnecessary to make such distinctions. So from my point of view, I'm interested in autonomous systems, autonomous cyber physical systems that are doing something on the basis of, partly on the basis of programs that have been put into them, but also on the basis of their own experience. And it's their own experience bit that gives them intelligence. So if you ask a person, if you ask a small child, how did you learn to do this thing? They can't actually explain it to you, but if you watch them, you will find out that for 2 years they played with blocks, played with Play-Doh, they poured water here and there, they slipped and fell. All of this is the experience on the basis of which they constructed skill. And it's only after that that we are able to steer that skill around and get them to be specialists. So robotics works in much the same way. So in our work, and the bit of my work that I'm going to talk about today, we've been asking the question, can we take this into a socially useful domain? And for us, one domain that I personally find very fascinating is medicine. Is it possible for us to help the entire chain, starting from clinical diagnosis all the way up to surgery as it's done in the operating theater? Can we apply robotics and machine learning in this pipeline? And can we do it in such a way that it is not an imposition upon the medical team, but it's something that they would actually want to use? It's only then that these technologies have impact. So for us, the real challenge is how do we structure it? What are the problems that they face and how do we take it there? But let me start out by telling you a little bit about, building on this theme of what is a robot. Let me show you some examples from my lab. So here's one example. This is a robotic system. So the person wearing the t-shirt is my PhD student, Svetlin, and he's assembling a small piece of robotic kit. And this red arm that you see is an autonomous robot. So it's called Baxter. It's been programmed to help Svetlin. And it's been programmed in the sense that it's watching with video cameras what he's doing, and it's getting a few more pieces of information that I'll tell you about. Now, this process of offering assistance is completely autonomous. Nobody is remote controlling this robot, so the robot is making those choices for itself, and it's acting to the best of its ability to be helpful. So it'll hand him tools, it'll hold bits and pieces of the kit. And all of this is towards making his task as straightforward as possible. So if he had to scramble around the lab and fetch his own tools and get his own parts and so on, he'll be less efficient than if the environment is actually helping him quite a bit and he can focus on the more difficult bit. Now, one reason this is set up this way is that we've come to understand that there are certain capabilities in people that turns out to be very, very hard to replicate. If you think about the level of subtlety with which we can do things with our fingers and hands, just think about the kitchen, all the tasks that we do in our kitchen. It's very hard for us to replicate this, simply because of the level of force sensing we need, the level of kind of dexterous touching we need. So we can't replicate all of that, and maybe we don't really need to. So we can let the human be good where they're good. And then we utilize the robots around this where they are good. So for instance, robots can be much more tireless in how long they can work and how they can pick up parts and things like that. And so we let these robots do that bit. Now the next video clip, I need audio for this, is a completely different aspect of assistance. This is also in my lab. It's the same robot. This is still assistance. It's in exactly the same paradigm that I've been talking about earlier. In this case, the robot is able to speak to the person. The premise here is that we are trying to take on tasks that would be pretty typical in a warehouse or a shop floor or a variety of different manufacturing kind of setups. You can easily imagine, if I were the car mechanic lying down under a car in the old-fashioned way and trying to fix it, and I said, please give me the screwdriver, this is what you would want. And you don't want to give, extremely specialized instructions, give me screwdriver number this at this many millimeters. Nobody talks like that. People say, just hand me a screwdriver, and then the robot does it. But there are a couple of things that are going on here that begin to push the boundaries of intelligence. So when we say, do you have a laser scanner and things like that, and can you please hand this to me, the robot has to ground very, very vaguely specified English language terms to what it must do with its hands. So to hand over means come roughly close to the other person's hands, not let go until the other person has it. Don't scare them in the process of doing this. And there's lots and lots of common sense knowledge that is associated with this, that the robot must somehow assimilate and execute on. It's very hard to program this common sense knowledge, which is why we get the robots to learn. They learn from watching other people. They learn from instructions that we give them and then additional trial and error to understand what those instructions meant. And all of that goes on to making these robots intelligent. So when people say, how can a machine be intelligent? The first thing you must do is try to understand what might one mean by intelligence. And this is what I mean when we say intelligence. And this is what we want to replicate. Right? We can also more directly teach machines. So here's an example of a person doing a task on one side of the screen, and then the robot eventually having learned that same task and executing it on another side of the screen. The way we do this is that we have eye tracking glasses on the person, so we know exactly where they're paying attention. So the way eye tracking glasses work, we have a camera that's put into the glasses that look at where the pupils are. And when you fixate on something, we can see from looking at your eyes that you must be fixating there. So if I knew what's in the environment, where the person is fixating, what they said was the task, and if I were to correlate all of these pieces of information, then I can get quite a bit of a good understanding of this is what the task must be. And when we give that to the robot as a specification, and then it executes the task, it's able to perform much better. And that's what you see in this video. So these are all examples of us trying to build intelligent robots. And the purpose of the intelligent robot is to act as an assistant in a fairly complex mission. So these are not kind of trivial tasks. To be able to program this from scratch would be quite a bit of effort. And now we are asking the question, can we take all of this information, can we take all of these capabilities and turn them to use in an operating theater environment? So for the past few years, I've been working with surgeons and clinicians, and we've been asking the question, this is the kind of thing we can do in our lab. We could do this in the shop floors, we could do it here. Can we take it to the hospital? And I've been fortunate that I've met a few really talented surgeons who see the potential in this and who are willing to work with us. One of them is a neurosurgeon who's also in the University of Edinburgh, who himself has been dabbling before I met him with computer vision technologies and trying to see how we could bring that in. So it was quite a fortuitous kind of mixing of the minds. So what are we trying to achieve? One way to describe our aspirations is to think in terms of levels of autonomy, which is a terminology that comes out of the autonomous vehicles space. When people think about autonomy in vehicles, they talk about levels of autonomy that goes from 1, which is not much autonomy at all. This is just a regular car with a little bit of control system. And level 5, which is the car will drive itself, no human driver necessary. And where technology today is in the autonomous vehicle space is that maybe we can do something like 3, which is that the car will mostly drive itself, but you better watch it. In the medical space, all robot surgery as it's currently deployed is restricted to 1 and 2. So the best thing you can find if you were to go to a hospital and speak to a surgeon who says they're using a robot would be something like the robots that are made by Intuitive Surgical, which is an American company, or CMR, which is a Cambridge-based company that's doing the same thing. Both of these are essentially teleoperation setups in the sense that the surgeon performs a maneuver using certain instruments, and that maneuver is replicated onto the robot, and it's the robot that's operating on you, but during the entire course of the operation, the surgeon is completely in charge. So it's not really autonomous, although it's robotic. Okay? And there are reasons why we should start this way, because the concept should be proven. The entire medical staff need to trust that it is okay to have such a system deployed. So this was the perfectly proper place to start. And equally, we all agree that maybe it's too early, if ever, for there to be a completely autonomous surgeon that's doing the entire operation on you. But there's a big middle ground in between which is completely untouched. And that's what we want to go after. So we are interested in asking the question, is it possible for us to increase the levels of autonomy? And in particular, can we increase the levels of autonomy in the sense that all of the imaging and all of the sensing that's normally done by clinicians before they go into the operating theater, can we do that in real time during the operation in situ? Those of you who are involved with the health system are well aware that many of the targets that are being set for the overall efficiency of the system are not being met. And much of this has to do with skills shortages, not being able to assemble teams quickly, and so on. And our hope is that if you had systems like this that the team could draw on, so it's still a human surgeon who's the expert, but if they could say, in addition to these two helpers, a junior surgeon and a nurse, I'm going to take robot A and robot B with me, and it's this team that's going to operate, maybe we could be more efficient. That's one approach. Equally, you could have global health use cases where certain kinds of surgeries are never performed in one part of the world or the other, but then they could transfer this expertise across because they have access to this. So we're trying to explore all of these use cases, but at this moment, we are still building technology. And then we are hoping that over the next decade or so, when we work with these surgeons, it's going to make its way out there. So in the time that I have today, I'm going to kind of give you an overview of two different projects that we're working on. The first project is my Turing Fellowship funded project that we called Safer Surgery, where the AI is meant to refer to the fact that we are trying to go after safety, but we are using AI to get there. And this is a very broadly conceived project in the sense that we are addressing everything from helping a nurse to kind of giving surgeons the ability to do better imaging. Then I'll come back and tell you about another much more targeted project around cancer surgery. So this is a snapshot of the setup that I have in my lab today. So what you will see is something that looks like an operating theater. So because we never intend to put real humans through this operation here, the table is just a table. It's not a very fancy medical table. But everything else is pretty realistic. You see robot arms that are mounted on the ceiling in much the same way that things are mounted on the ceiling of an operating theater today. We have a variety of medical imaging units, including ultrasound and vision. And the point here is that we are trying to explore what are the things that we could try to automate in an assistive fashion. And for us, the first thing that we started with when we started asking the question of what would be worth automating is thinking about the teaching pipeline. So before they let us get into the operating theater and actually operate, it seemed much easier for us to try to help them out in terms of we can help you with the teaching process so that you trust us as a team, and then you can adopt the rest of it. And within the teaching pipeline, one of the most important questions that people ask is, how do you know that a surgeon, a trainee surgeon, has gone up the learning curve? So you start out, and in the beginning, you're told a few things, such as, this is how you should thread a needle. I mean, literally, that is one of the first tasks that they're told, is this is how you kind of move suture through certain holes. And then they go to more complicated things, such as this is how you cut, this is how you kind of do things. And they have a bank of these tasks. And one way in which some of the students are trained in their early surgical classes is to use a trainer box like the one that you see there. This is a laparoscopic training unit. So that box is actually created by my collaborator, Paul Brennan, who's one of the surgeons I'm working with. And the way these units are used, the trainee surgeon comes in, they're given a bank of tasks. They can only operate through those two holes that you see on the box, and they can only be seen through a camera. But that is pretty realistic in terms of how laparoscopic surgery actually works. I mean, the camera might change and then the box might change, but this is sort of how they interface with it. But the advantage of this setup is that we can get quite a bit of information out of this box. So we know exactly where their tools are at any given point in time. We know what they were seeing, we know what the ground truth was, and all of this information is available to us. And this now begins to look like quote unquote big data as people talk about it. So if we have all of this data about how different people perform the same task and how they do it over time and what the variabilities might be, we can learn models and then we can give predictive models that say, if this is what I observed of this particular person, they are somewhere here on the learning curve. So this was a very good in for us, and there are a variety of such techniques that people have been using. And once we did that, the next thing that we got to doing was to ask the question, can we look at various tasks that surgical nurses take on, and is there something we can do there? So our collaborators were kind enough to let normal people like me, get in a surgical gown and mask and go stand right next to them and watch the whole thing. And after watching a few operations, it occurred to us that although we started out by thinking about the heroic task of let's try to automate things that the surgeons do, the most overworked people in the operating theater are the nurses. Absolutely, they are the most overworked people. And the reason is that they're doing a number of different things. They're assisting the surgeons with, taking out bits of tissue and things like that. They're handing them the tools. They're keeping track of swabs. They're doing a number of different things in parallel. They can't make a mistake in any one of them. And the cognitive load on them is quite high. And sometimes they are doing two things at the same time, the same person. So this got us to asking, is it possible for us to give them aids? So could the nurse themselves become more of a supervisor in which they could say, you do the suction for some time until I come back, and then they go watch this, and they'd say, you do the stacking of this until I come back. And they could have the ability to choreograph all of these. So we've automated parts of this. So we now have a suction unit that would that has learned from experience of watching nurses how to perform suction in relatively open surgery scenarios. We have the ability to do various kinds of dabbing and swabbing and things like that happen within the surgical setup. So these were all kind of inroads into the operating room, if you like. So when you walk in with a technology, people are rightly suspicious of why would I trust you? And these early projects were our inroads into saying, these are the kinds of things that we can actually do. And then the project that really opened the door for us, that finally became very exciting from a machine learning point of view for us on the computer science side, and was quite useful from a surgical side, was when we started to teach these robots how to do imaging. So the task that we took on was to ask, if you went into a diagnostic laboratory and somebody was using an ultrasound machine, let's say in the simplest case, the maternity ultrasound where the nurse is kind of looking for the fetus. There's a very delicate force-based interaction that they do in the process of trying to find out where they want to search. So they don't just go there and scan the area like that. They're actually delicately changing the level of force, the angle, and the ways in which they do it such that they can get the best view. And then from that, they can reconstruct what they think is going on. What we wanted to do was to teach the robot to do the same thing. And by teach, I mean a person provides kind of demonstrations like that, where they say, this is how I do it. We collect all of that information, and then from that we learn, this is how you should execute it. This also really pushed the boundaries of machine learning for us. So one of the kind of attributes of these demonstrations that we notice, when we make them teach in this somewhat artificial scenario of use a robot arm and then push it like this, nobody does it quite the same way as they would have done it themselves. So their demonstrations are suboptimal. But this is where the machine learning technology really comes in, because we found a lot of technical features that we could bring from computer science into this area that allowed us to learn models despite all of this data being noisy and suboptimal, and still be able to teach the robot. And this is the outcome. So here you see the robot seeing a number of different phantoms, which are different tissue consistency, different places of where we place the tumor-like object. And the robot almost always finds it in much the same way that people do. So this is a human competitive AI-guided imaging system. And this became really interesting for us, because we are now at the cusp of being able to take this and say, if you could do this in situ in the operating room, then you can get information much better than you today can. Because today, if a surgeon wanted this kind of information, they'd have to take the patient off the operating theater, take them to another imaging unit, image them, come back, put them on. And that's much more cumbersome than if you could bring these technologies into this. So that was quite exciting for us. And then we've been thinking about how we could take all of this to, for us, the ultimate task of actually performing the operation ourselves. And what does it feel like when you cut, and can you tell the difference between soft tissue and hard tissue and different kinds of tissue? And this is something that we are actively working on at the moment. So here you see a bank of different consistency and texture of tissues and what the force profile looks like as the robot tries to cut it, which then becomes the data. So we are now manufacturing our own tool with force sensors embedded in them so that we can give them to our surgeon collaborators who will cut with them. We take all of that data and then we give it to the robot and say, now you know what it feels like to cut, so do it like that. So here's an example of the robot doing the cutting. So this is a Sunday morning, so I'm not going to show you actual operation videos. So we're going to cut grapefruit instead. But actually, I mean, so my cancer research collaborators tell me that the grapefruit comes closest to how brain versus brain tumor feels like. So in terms of actual textural kind of properties, this is a very good replica of brain surgery. But it's much easier to show to you on a Sunday morning. And what you should take away is the dexterity with which the robot has now learned how to manipulate this, the knife in that situation. I would find it very hard to scoop out grapefruit in much the same way that the robot is doing. When I try to do it, I drop it half the time, but the robot's able to do it pretty well. And what it's doing is using a combination of force sensing at runtime. So it is trying to sense what is the feel of the pulp that I'm cutting through. And it has prior information such as that I want to roughly be between the soft and the hard part of it. And so it's performing what's called a classification. So it's trying to classify, am I in the hard bit or am I in the soft bit? And the best cutting routine is when you're exactly uncertain about being soft or hard. So the interface between them is the right place to cut, which is what the robot has learned to do. So a little bit to the motivation. I mean, all of this is interesting, and as an engineer, I mean, this is what I've always wanted to do, so I do it. But from a social point of view, what is the big motivation? Why would we bring in robotics and autonomy into this mix? So it's a well-established statistic that 1 in 4 deaths are due to cancer in most of the developed world. So the numbers come from UK and US data, but this is probably true of much of the developed world. And certain kinds of cancers have a survival rate that are much worse than others. So breast cancer is actually one of the best in that we can mostly catch it early and fix it, whereas pancreatic or ovarian cancer is very, very hard to detect, and when it's detected, it's often too late. And so the opportunity here, I think, is for us to combine the kind of imaging work that I've been talking about with high precision cutting, with human supervision to say what they want done. And putting all of this into the loop might improve, firstly, the accuracy and eventually the survival rates. So that's what we are trying to do. And the way in which we are trying to do this is to go from collecting data from human experts, casting that into a computational form where we can reason about it, and then using that to safely perform these maneuvers. So the bit about robotics that one should always worry a lot about is whether we can safely do these things. So if you think about autopilot in a plane or anything automated that you've ever worked with, it mostly works, but sometimes it doesn't, right? And so in these kinds of safety critical domains, a big issue is how do you guarantee that sometimes can also be handled well? What do you have in place? So one of the technologies that we've been working with is a mechanism for us to inject knowledge incrementally. So what do I mean? So imagine the kind of setups that I've been saying where a person says, this is how you do the task. This is how you pour water. This is how you do suction. And if the robot has learned a model like that, we want to come in later and say, in addition to what you've learned, I want you to never shake more than this. I don't want you to go faster than this, or I want you to eventually always do this. These things in engineering safety kind of work would be specified as logical formulae. So this is what a mathematician would do and say, I want you to always respect this. And so the squiggles that you see there are examples of formulae written down in something called linear temporal logic, which is a way in which we write down safety specifications. This is how, if you ask how is an autopilot proved to be correct, it's proved to be correct because engineers write down specifications like this and check for them. So what we are doing is to ask, can we do the same kind of checking on medical robots? If we can, then we can get the same kind of assurance. So we are being slightly more ambitious in that where historically one just checked if an engineered artifact was safe, now we want to check if a learning-based system is safe. And this makes the mathematics somewhat more complicated. But this is what will ultimately give us the assurance that not only are we able to build autonomous systems that are useful, but we can also render them safe enough that people might want to use them in practical use cases. So here are two examples of how we make the robot somewhat more reliable. And so the robot might do all kinds of crazy things when we first teach it the task. And we might say, no, I don't like how you're doing that. I want you to enforce this. And you're still not doing it right. Do this. And so we incrementally talk to the robot and give it all of these specifications. So that is a sort of broad-based view of a number of different things we've done in our Turing Institute project, all of them aimed at this question of, is it possible to build AI and robotics that is useful in this setup? Next, I want to tell you about another project that I'm working on. This is funded by Cancer Research UK. And it's a collaboration between a number of different universities that we call MammoBot. And this is aimed at early diagnosis of breast cancer. So one of the big challenges with cancer is, of course, it is a difficult disease in that if we don't detect it properly and if we don't treat it properly, then the fatalities are high. But for certain kinds of cancers, it's very hard to detect it early enough. There are no signs until it's too late, right? And so the statistics with breast cancer are that by the time women find this in a mammogram, even with our current screening programs and even with a lot of care that's put into it, if you find it in a mammogram, you already have this, which means we didn't detect it early. So genuine early detection would be if we can find it before it becomes a problem and before it actually shows up in these screens. And so what currently happens is that by the time women find this in a mammogram, it already exists, and then in a large majority of those cases, the only proper way to deal with it is to perform tissue resection and to take out parts of the tissue, which is quite damaging to the person, right? And all of this means a tremendous amount of money is spent from the health system in dealing with something that if you could catch it early, would be much better. So motivated by that, one of the things we've been looking at, and so this is led by a breast cancer surgeon based out of Imperial College, who's the PI for the project. And our observation is that a large majority of breast cancer cases actually begin in the ducts. And so this is called ductal carcinoma in situ. So it doesn't just become a lump in the tissue straight away. It begins as a very small lump in the ducts. And it so happens that the ducts can actually be inspected. If I could kind of make a somewhat crude analogy, the ducts are no different from the pipe system of any engineering kind of process. If it were possible to inspect it, if it were possible to go in and inspect this, then it is no different from that. And this potentially and here by potentially we mean 10 years from now, this is the kind of thing that could turn into an early diagnosis test that could catch things much, much earlier than mammograms could do. And so what we are trying to do is to take what is currently known as the process of ductoscopy. So what you see here is the surgeon doing this entire thing manually. They're inserting a fiber optic cable with a sensor at the tip of it. And they're inserting it through the nipple of the breast, which is roughly the same diameter as the fiber optic cable. And as I see from a few people who are wincing at this, that's exactly how it's received by patients today. I mean, this is not a comfortable process at all. And for which reason, most breast cancer units don't really use it. It's available to them, but they don't use it because it's not at all comfortable. Right? And so what we are trying to do is to innovate on all directions. So we are trying to explore what would it mean to create soft robots that are not quite like this, whose touch and feel, if you like, is completely different. This is on the mechanical and materials end of it. We're trying to ask the question, if we could get spectroscopy and other kinds of information from the ends of these cables, then what could we do in terms of diagnosis, which is the machine learning side of it. And then there's the very practical matter of, if you're going to try to have robots that are exploring this, how do you not get lost? Because robots don't really know where they are inside the body. And so if we can solve all of these, then in principle, we can bring all of these technologies together, and that would give us the ability to look at videos like what you see here. So what's going on at the bottom and what's going on there. That's what the video feed to a surgeon would look like if they tried to do this kind of inspection. And the machine learning side of this is to ask, how would you properly do this inspection and get back data? And then the mechanical and the material side of it is to ask, how could such a device be built in such a way that people will agree to use it? Right? And so there's both just the physical design aspect of it, and then there's the intelligence side of it. But if we could bring all of this together, and any such project, I mean, just to be clear and to give you a flavor of what it feels like to work on something like this, any such project involves a kind of consortium of people with different skills. So in this case, we have people whose specialties range from laser optics to epidemiology to robotics, in my case, to soft materials, and bring all of this together to build any such robot. That is both the challenge, but for somebody like me, that's also the excitement of it. It's much more interesting for a scientist to be working in a team like this and to get ideas from all over the place than just to sit with the one problem that you've always worked on. And so it's quite fascinating to be working on all of these things. So the last few things I want to say before I open the floor to discussion and have a conversation with you is that as we work on all of these areas, so I've been working in the area of robotics and robot learning for about 20 years now. And as we work in these areas and as we think about taking them into the real world. So for me, it's only exciting to do all of this in robotics if I can take it into real applications and see it be used and actually change the world and not just have it be in my lab. So then we have to ask a number of different questions which are really social and kind of ethical questions. So the first one is what would it take for the clinical and surgical teams to actually want my device? Right? So it shouldn't be a case of I built it and I'm pushing it on them. I can keep pushing it, but it's most exciting if they came back and say, that thing you built, can you build this version of it and can I use it? That's what we want. But that turns into a participatory process of us trying to have a discussion with them. So we need to know everything about what would the eventual patient feel like, what would the nurse feel like, what would the surgeon think about it. And there are kind of big questions about how this might actually fit into the organizational structure. So if we think about the UK context, where the health system is a big national health system, but at the very outset, it's broken into regional health systems in that NHS Scotland is a different trust from many trusts in NHS England. which has implications on how data can be shared, which has implications on, what kind of protocols can actually be mandated, which then means that there are complexity limits for what we can do with algorithms. So we can say, I'm going to come up with this fancy algorithm that just aggregates all of the data, and then we realize, actually, you can't do that because those people won't give you the same data as these people will give you. So we have to think about all of this as well. And then there are plenty of questions around, what are the kind of various bioethical and kind of governance and regulation aspects of all of these kinds of systems. So I'm quite heavily involved in efforts at the UK national level in thinking about trustworthy autonomous systems, which has me working with lawyers, sociologists, ethics specialists and so on. So all of these things are questions that we have to address for all this to work. So I want to conclude by saying that there are many, many opportunities for bringing AI and robotics into the operating rooms and more broadly into the health system. If you are a technologist, it's very exciting because this is one of the big grand challenges in society that we can have an impact on. If you're a medical professional, I would say we really can create systems that can improve the efficiency of that system. So I've shown you two or three examples. But these are just kind of initial systems that are kind of samples from a much larger space. So with that, I'll stop talking. I'm very happy to have a discussion and take questions.